And you're watching Interface here on SABC3. Good evening to you. My name is Tembi Samachele. Little groggy today, do bear with me. But the show does go on, and it's a whole hour tonight. That's because we're talking about the outcomes of the ANC's policy conference. And the ANC says it has come out of the policy conference with firm commitments aimed at ensuring that poverty, inequality and unemployment is addressed. We'll find out if that is indeed the case. And while the party still needs to finalize the conference resolution, South Africans are waiting with bated breath to see if there will be progress. Now, before we get into the discussion with my guest tonight, let's take a look at this insert compiled by Kinosikwini.
South Africa, a country of many contradictions. Amid a sea of poverty and squalor, there is also a significant number of those living in affluence. Since coming to power in 1994, the ANC government vowed to tackle massive inequalities. Some measurable strides 18 years later, many South Africans now have access to basic necessities such as water, electricity and some decent housing. And no doubt the achievement of democracy has become the greatest accomplishment of the so-called Rainbow Nation. The emergence of a black middle class, something unheard of during apartheid, has been one of the major successes that the ANC-led government can boast about. But economic emancipation remains elusive for South Africa's poorest, mainly black, living in rural areas and sprawling informal settlements across the country's cities. The three challenges of unemployment, poverty and inequality remain the biggest obstacles. South Africa's number of young, unskilled and unemployable is rising alarmingly. Recent statistics by the Labour Force Survey show that youth unemployment has increased by 9.9% to a staggering 42%. Service delivery protests have become a trademark for those fighting for resources. At the end of the ANC's policy-making conference, have we got a clear idea on the direction we are headed on contentious issues such as the youth wage subsidy, land reform, nationalization, and the state's role in the economy? Most will agree that if those in leadership do not throw their weight behind the policies, the ANC's aspirations spelled out at the conference could remain a pipe dream. Kinosikwini, Interface.
All right, thank you very much to Kinosikwini for that report. Now remember that you can also join this discussion by sending us your comments as usual to 33726 on SMS or on our Facebook page, Interface on SABC3. Now, let's introduce you to our guest tonight. We have the Minister in the Presidency in charge of the National Planning Commission, Minister Trevor Manuel. We also have Policy and Economic Analyst, Lebogang Pheko. COSATU President Dumo Dlamini is also joining us tonight, and Political Analyst Moletsi Mbeki. That's our panel for tonight, talking about this policy conference. Let's start with the two analysts, because you are affected directly, Minister and Mr. Dlamini. What were your impressions of this conference? Do you think it was a resounding success, as the ANC claims?
Yes, I think so. I think first you have to realize that the ANC operates at two levels. On one level, it's a private membership organization. So they did not have to open the conference to the rest of the country. The whole conference could have been held behind closed doors. All the papers that the ANC released didn't have to be released to the public, but the ANC opened the door to the public for all of us to see what, as a private organization, what they were going to be discussing. And in that respect, I think everybody in South Africa had a look at what the ruling party is thinking about the way forward. You may agree, you may disagree, you may agree with some and not agree with others, but at least they open the door for all of us to see how it formulates policy.
Lebogang, having opened that door, should we as South Africans be dismayed? Should we be disgruntled? Should we be discouraged? Or should we be encouraged and happy that we saw what we saw happening at the conference?
It was a timely process. I think that certainly the groundswell for us, some impetus towards tangible change and certainly consolidating the 18-year program to date needed to occur, and this was the perfect catalyst. But I think I beg to differ a bit with Moletsi that it was an act of largesse, in a sense, to share the documentation, because clearly the voter has an interest, a profound interest in understanding whether or not the things which they voted for, the mandate which they gave to the party, is in fact being altered significantly, whether it's being consolidated, whether there's a radical shift to the left, to the right, backwards or forward. So I think that it was important that it was a public discussion, because it's in the public interest, and because the issues which are burning of common and popular concern right now, around governance, around service delivery, around the judiciary, around a whole host of things. So it was only appropriate that this conversation, this collective conversation, was taking place, particularly right now.
Should the ANC be patting itself on the back, though, now that this conference is over, and saying, you know, we did a great job, it was a success, we achieved what we wanted to achieve?
It depends how we measure success. I think success is in whether or not there's cohesive and coherent implementation going forward. It also depends on how long it takes for any of these policy shifts to see any results as well. I mean, I think that any party needs to engage in a rigorous process of introspection and reflection.
Yeah.
And as I say, it was a timely moment. I wouldn't say that it was something that particularly calls for cracking the champagne, but I think that it was important, and I think that the achievement was that several conversations which had been taking place over the years around jobs, around landlessness, etc., were finally consolidated literally under one roof. And I think that in itself is an achievement, but I would hold off on I'd hold off on saying further than that until we see implementation.
Minister, what's the importance of this particular conference? Because we heard a number of times in the lead up to the conference, top ANC members saying, this is not a decision-making platform. This is just going to feed into the conference in December.
Thank you very much. Let me make 2 points. The first point is to amplify on what Mr. Mbeki said. The ANC is an organization of its members, and one of the rights of membership, in fact, rights and duties of membership, is to participate in policy making. And I don't know of any political organization anywhere in the world that is as detailed as this. You convene 3,500 people from around the country with different experiences, different outlooks, and invite them to participate in a very detailed process. And we emerge from this conference, some 4 days of detailed discussion on a range of issues, with a set of views that will be consolidated and fed back to branches, because the Constitution requires that policy changes be adopted at a conference, and the 53rd conference will be held in Mangaung in December. I think it's that speaks to a democracy, and it's actually a wonderfully rich experience, because you have people who have very detailed policy skills. They might be academics. You have people who are involved in policy making in government, and you have people coming from the branches who have a view. But it's actually quite amazing to live through this process and recognize just how articulate and focused the discussion can be, and again has been. And that, I think, is a strength of democracy that we must celebrate in this.
And how articulate and focused was the discussion? Because as outsiders who were following this in the media, we sometimes got the impression that there was factionalism, infighting, and that there wasn't really any coherent discussion happening at the level of all the delegates, besides what was happening in the commissions.
Look, every delegate participated in the commission at least for two full days. That was a reflection. I happened to chair one of the commissions, and it was pretty detailed discussion. Everybody participated. I think we probably had about 90 different people participate in our commission. Now, that speaks to a depth of participation that one must celebrate. The issues, I mean, the first 2 sets of issues were broad political issues. The first was trying to get a handle, and it's traditional that the ANC kind of gets a sense of where we are. It's called the strategy and tactics discussion. And then we took a view of organizational renewal, and that was pretty detailed stuff. It's evaluating the strength of the engine to carry us forward, and whether, in fact, the analysis on the table is appropriate. And if people think that it's all factional, just bear in mind that frequently in the minds of analysts and the press, there was one set of views, there was going to be the second transition. But by virtue of the fact that this matter was discussed and the views articulated and agreed upon were not the same as those going in, I think we must recognize the intensity of the democratic process inside the ANC.
But was the discussion as divided as what we were seeing?
I didn't find it divided at all.
Okay.
I sat in both the plenaries and commissions all the way through.
All right.
I think that we must not be afraid of people articulating different views. And one of the risks of having these open processes is frequently we try and place people in camps when they articulate particular views. We must allow the views to be distilled, because politics is ultimately about persuasion as well.
All right. And I want us to talk about that second transition, that very contentious document, when we come back after the break. But I just want to bring you in as well, Mr. Dlamini. You were there as a representative from the Alliance, from COSATU. What policies in particular did you seek to influence going into this conference?
Thank you very much, and good evening to my co-panelists and yourselves. Indeed, COSATU went into that conference with very serious expectations on a range of issues, because remember, we are the ones who have emphasized the point. Our country is confronted with the triple challenges of unemployment, inequalities, poverty, and yet also when we speak to the strategy and tactics of the ANC in advancing the national democratic revolution, we think the fundamental area of focus is to deal with the contradictions of class, race, and gender. Mm-hmm. And we went into this conference in our minds waiting to see, but also to participate on how we traverse the route. Indeed, when you're talking the organizational renewal, we were expecting to have serious discussions, not just for the ANC's benefit, also for COSATU and the SACP. The economic resolutions were very, very critical on the range of issues. You talk nationalization, you're talking issues that hinges on the new growth path. You're talking on areas which the Planning Commission has identified.
And in fact, we'll talk about all of those issues, but quickly, were your expectations met at this conference?
Our expectations were not going to be 100% met, but we come out of that conference happier that in the ANC there is a clear message that says this time we have to expand, we have to accelerate. The president says let's engage on the drive gear, which means let's escalate the pace, the radical transformation. That's what we'll be judging the ANC on going forward, and that's how we'll be engaging with the ANC going forward.
And that shift in gear is exactly what I'd like us to discuss right after this break. Just stay with us. Welcome back to Interface here on SABC 3, talking about the ANC's policy conference that just ended in Johannesburg with my guest, Minister in the Presidency in charge of the National Planning Commission, Minister Trevor Manuel, and also Policy Economic Analyst Lebogang Pheko, and COSATU President Tumo Dlamini, and Moletsi Mbeki, who is a political analyst. Now let's get into the issues that were discussed there. Firstly, the second transition now being the second phase of the first transition. Minister, are we just playing with words here?
Look, let me first make the point, and this is how our issues are actually distorted. If you read the document that was released some time ago on strategy and tactics, it was second transition ?
Okay.
Right. And so it was a debate about whether we are there. And the key issue was whether we have a sufficient head of steam to be able to accelerate transformation. Because what the document does is to try and analyze where we are, where we've come from over the past 18 years, which of the vestiges of South Africa's colonial past are still there, how we deal with the ravages of poverty, inequality and unemployment that continue to afflict our people, and whether we have the wherewithal to be able to take this forward. That was what gave rise to the notion of the second transition. But I think in the course of debate, people recognize that the notion of a second transition has a series of historical references that are not appropriate in the circumstances. So you have a broad agreement that we must try and accelerate implementation. It's not about resolutions. It's about implementation of change. And it was in an endeavor to try and get that people spoke of a second phase of democratization.
Well, what does it matter whether it's a second transition or a second phase? Implementation has always been the issue with this government, and surely, whether you call it one thing or the other, point is we need to get things done.
Yeah, well, I read the document myself, and I didn't think it mattered whether it was called second transition or some other word. I did think, though, that the document was not heavy enough, was not substantive enough in dealing with the issues that are facing the country. I think for me, this has been the disappointment about the conference. Mm-hmm. I got a feeling from reading the documents as well as from listening to the ANC leadership that they are not really on top of the game of what is happening in South Africa. For example, the president made this huge allegation that white males control the economy of South Africa. Well, this is very much not true. The white males don't control the economy. There are a huge number of participants in the economy of South Africa. For starters, most of the South African economy is not made up of companies listed in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. There's a huge number of companies that are family-owned, that are owned by blacks, whites, colors, Indians, whatever you, foreigners even. So I didn't feel that the leadership of the ANC is really on top of the challenges that the country is facing.
Minister, you're not on top of things as the leadership of the ANC.
Look, there are formulations in the documentation that were corrected in the course of discussion and debate. There are sometimes views articulated by individuals that may not accord. I think in a democracy we give life to that. There was the other debate as well about land. It's a very emotive issue, apart from being a fundamentally important economic issue. And the question, I think it's a moot question, whether Clause 25 of the Constitution actually allows A, for the holding of property, and B, for transformation. In my view, the Constitution actually allows for expropriation with just cause, and in an environment of general laws. I'd like us to discuss that a little later,
Minister, the land issue.
To that.
Yes, but just what Moletz was saying, that the way that this document was drafted, the second, whatever you want to call it, document, it shows that you don't have a handle as the leadership of this country.
Again, I think that you shouldn't jump to conclusions that easily. I think that the key question is what the document can do, should do. How it facilitates discussion is also important. Part of the big challenge is that we come from a tradition where documents have been drafted in a particular style. Some may call it the party school style. It had a particular intonation. It had a particular readership. And that gave it a particular style and sometimes a purported gravitas in the document. Now, in an attempt to modernize, I think sometimes you get things wrong, and we're living through that kind of transition now as well.
Okay. Lebogang, your impressions of that document?
Well, the document and also the whole construction of this, we need to decide whether or not, in my opinion, I would think that the second transition/phase is more of a political agenda, an ideological agenda, an understanding that there were a series of compromises made 18 years ago which now need to be redressed. And I think when the President made his opening remarks, he alluded to having managed that the last 18 years have been a series of managing of concessions, and that it is now time to redeem the years and deal with the notions and the issues of economic transformation much more meaningfully, and I suppose much more aggressively, with a lot more confidence as a country and as a government.
But isn't the issue on the how? Because we're hearing the intention. We want to be more radical. We want to change gear. We want to do all of this. But
Yes.
what are we going to do differently, really?
Well, I mean, I think that as a diagnostic exercise, the 4 days at Midrand were excellent. But I think I read the documents as descriptive rather than prescriptive, rather than really dealing with exactly those questions, the how. They read, I think I would agree somewhat with the minister's remarks, they read almost like a manifesto, and they're very difficult to engage with. They almost read like a fait accompli. So I think that for people of varying levels of expertise, of analysis, etc., the opportunity to begin to carve them, to deconstruct them, and to even then think about the how becomes incredibly difficult.
Stumo, looking at how people are grassroots at the moment, the service delivery protests that we've seen, workers have been a little bit agitated as well. Is that what we need, a manifesto type policy direction? Or should we be talking about the how of how this will happen?
Well, Tembeka, your question presupposes that COSATU thinks this is a manifesto type of the
You don't?
document. We don't.
Okay.
We looked into the document quite in advance. Obviously, we're in the alliance, and we were the first one to critique a range of elements of the document. Firstly, the second transition title, which we thought was not necessarily in keeps with what we ought to see in the document in as far as the content, because it sought to suggest that there are two stages of this revolution. There is a first stage of a political freedom, then it should be followed by the economic freedom. We understand the strategy and tactics of the ANC not to be working in that fashion. It tackles both challenges almost at the same time. The paces may not be equal, but it sought to address those equally. And therefore, when we get into the conference, we have already said that the title, as Baba Mwelezi has just said it very eloquently, it doesn't matter whether it's the second transition or the second phase of the transition, which to me sometimes may sound the same. If I'm standing on the other side, others would then say it means second term for Jacobs. It's not. And that's the mistake people were making. We said it has to talk to the strategy and tactics of the ANC, the 97, the 2007, and currently, and say how much do we need to change in it so that we escalate, we see the radical transformation of society, economically and otherwise.
And I want us to look at exactly what that radical change will be, and if indeed some of the allegations that have been made about this particular point are true. But let's do that right after this break. Remember, you can also take part in this discussion, 33726. Keep those SMSs coming, and also on our Facebook page, Interface on SABC3. Don't go away. And you're back on Interface here on SABC3 talking about the ANC's policy conference with my guests in studio. Datumbek, you were saying that, this is something that shows that the ANC leadership doesn't have a handle on issues in the country. And one of the things that Stumo was raising is that some people feel that this is President Zuma's way of stalling and buying time and just trying to make sure that he gives the country something to hold on to say, okay, there's something different that'll come. Meanwhile, it's just a smokescreen. What are your feelings about that?
Well, that was exactly my feeling when I read the document, was that it was shifting the discussion somewhat directing attention to something that really doesn't exist. The negotiations, first, they didn't start and end in 1994. They started in the 80s and didn't finish until 1996 when the Constitution of South Africa was agreed. So to say that there were certain things which we couldn't do then, which we will do now, well, it's not correct. The people who negotiated the Constitution of South Africa, the Constitution is here to stay. Yes, it is open to amendments. So I don't think it was correct to say, and it is a correct formulation, to say we couldn't do certain things which we can do now. There was a certain balance of power in South Africa. Then that balance of power still remains. And South Africa, and the people think that the negotiations were between the National Party and the ANC. There were many other players that were involved in that situation besides the other political parties. Business was involved. The Americans were involved. The British were involved. The Russians. So it was a far more complex situation. And those parties are still interested parties in how the economy of South Africa works, in ensuring that our economy works, because they have investments in this country. So you can't just stand up and say, I will do X, Y, Z, nationalize mines, etc., because now we are no longer in 1994. We are now in 2012, and therefore we are in a better position to take over the mines. That is not the situation. So I thought this was a big red herring in my view. Instead of addressing the real constraints under which the ANC government operates and explaining them to the people correctly. Explain to the people what are the constraints, what are your real handicaps. To say it's willing buyer, willing seller, the Chief Justice, the former Chief Justice, pointed out there's no such a constraint in the Constitution.
Minister, the whole notion that this whole second transition document has pitted President Zuma against Deputy President Kgalema Motlanthe, and that if you support the document, you fall on the one side, and if you're against certain aspects of the documents, then you are seen to be supporting another candidate or possible candidate for Mangaung. Is that really based on reality, or is it just the media being mischievous?
No, I think that people expect everybody to be marching in step as though we are tin soldiers. The ANC has never been like that. We aren't tin soldiers. There is a freedom of conscience and debate, and I've never associated those views with one or the other camp. The minute we do that, discussion becomes impossible, and you couldn't convene either a policy conference now or even a conference at the end of the year where policy will be decided upon if the idea was to bring people into camps. And so, I agree with Moletsi entirely. It's a bit of a red herring to bring in a big factional debate as undergirding positions on this document.
Lebogang, let's go back to the land issue. It's come up a couple of times in this discussion. And the position that the ANC has adopted or has put forward at this policy conference, that whatever will be done will be within the confines of the Constitution. Is that some kind of withdrawal or moving back from the radical stance that South Africans thought we were going through to?
Look, I suppose as a school of thought, we could say the radical stance was compromised in 1994. And certainly the construction of the Constitution, which states that the Sunset Clause only deals with land up to that was taken after 1913, is still deeply unsatisfactory to many people. So in that respect, even the point of departure is inherently flawed. Now, the notion as well that there are several billion rands that have been put aside, or may be put aside, in order to then buy back land that was taken, and the very rather long-winded and rather complex process of ascertaining that which was taken illegally, etc., again, seems to be yet another concession which dates back to the previous discussions at CODESA. But I think that more importantly than that, what is the defining factor of Midrand, or of the Midrand consensus, is whether this is going to be a radical shift away from what has been, including attacking economic growth much more with much more deliberateness and much more aggression, attacking the often cited triangle of poverty, inequality, and joblessness with much more aggression. Again, as I say, as a diagnostic exercise, we do well in South Africa and Midrand. Again, the diagnostics were excellent. But in terms of shifting,
can the ANC and the government as a whole inject into this now?
We have choices to make, Tembiswa, about what kind of policy direction we want to take. And those choices are ours to make as a sovereign nation. We can choose to pursue inflation targeting or not. We can choose to pursue a protectionist economy or not. We can choose to protect sectors where there are women or where there are low-skilled workers or not. There are things that we can do. We can choose to manipulate interest rates or not, taxes and tariffs or not, import and export subsidies or not, in order to favor local producers, etc. But we have policy choices to make, and the policy choices that have been made over the last 18 years have actually led to greater inequality.
Let's just pick up on that point, Minister. There are specific things that would need to be done to show that the government, and the ANC in particular, is being even more radical than before. Is the government then considering some of the things that Lebogang is talking about to show that there is a shift in gear?
Look, Lebogang and I think, will disagree on the land issue. Once you accept the property clause, once you accept the right of individuals and communities to own property, then I think there are certain legal constraints. You can't just walk in and confiscate without legal process. And what Clause 25 does is actually to provide that legal certainty. And you can't build an economy anywhere without legal certainty. Don't ask me, ask the Zimbabweans about that issue. You can't build an economy without legal certainty, and that's what Clause 25 provides for. That the implementation has not gone as speedily as what we would have liked is the problem. So it's not a constitutional constraint, and I think that you, in talking about the confines of the Constitution, are not correct either, because the Constitution doesn't confine. It provides legal certainty, and that is a fundamentally important platform for building anywhere. In respect of the economy broadly, again, I think there's an implementation or set of implementation questions. If you go back just over 20 years ago, in May of 1992, we had a conference called Ready to Govern. And on that occasion, we adopted a formulation about the role of the state in the economy, suggesting that the state could nationalize, enter into joint ventures, or retreat, using the balance of evidence. And I think that strip away slogans, what we emerge with from this conference is an affirmation of that position. The question is balance of evidence and the intent to apply.
But Minister, I'm still not satisfied. I think the point that Lebogang was making, which I thought was quite important, was that you would, as a government, need to make very strong policy decisions around your interference in markets, for example, around what you would do with very specific economic pillars in our society today, to be able to say you are shifting gear. Will you be considering any of those?
Look, let me emphasize again that you've got to do these things on the balance of evidence. Economics is ultimately about weighing up consequences. It's not about emotion.
Right.
And you have to, you see, let me just go back.
I've got to take a short break, Minister, and I'd like you to continue on that point, and Lebogang, I'd like your response right after this. Welcome back to Interface here on SABC 3. Just taking a quick look at some of your Facebook messages. Lita Letu says, so is the ANC now saying that it needs a second chance to do things proper, or does it need more time to carry on doing what it's doing? That's one of the questions coming through on Facebook. And somebody else, Jonathan Minyuku, says, it was a good conference, but as always, individuals within the ANC always have a tendency of mixing things up and not putting the citizens first. So some of your messages coming through saying that it's almost 20 years and we're still having the same discussions, and that's really what we're trying to get at in this discussion tonight. What will change? What are we likely to see that will be different? And we'll get the views of COSATU in a short while, but we just want to pick up on that last point that you were making, Minister, before the break.
You know, if you want economic development, you have to know what the wherewithal is. The first thing is you must have policies, and we come from a tradition of long policies. And in policy implementation, there are gaps, and what the insert right at the start of this show reflected on is youth unemployment, and we have very poor output in education, school education for the majority of black South Africans. That's the problem. That's the first kind of constraint we need to get past. You're not going to be able to have an economy you dream of unless you have more people participating. So on policy, you need to be able to follow through on implementation. Second issue is you must have savings that you can transfer into investment. South Africa is saving shy, and because we have too little savings to grow at the rates we do, we are dependent on savings from elsewhere. The third issue is you've got to be able to utilize your collective resources, and we have to ensure that we can use our mineral resources to better effect instead of individuals appropriating the proceeds of that. We should in fact be investing differently.
But Minister, the problems that you're highlighting have been there all along. What will change? What on earth are we going to do differently that's going to show how radical we are and that something will change for the people of South Africa?
You see, I don't think that we must be radical for the sake of being radical. I think
then
that
why
we
are
must
using the rhetoric?
I think that we must be radical in the implementation of decisions that have been long-standing.
Why are we using the rhetoric then, that we're shifting gear, we're doing all of this?
I'm saying that the shift, and you will find it in the way in which this second phase has been articulated, we need to focus on detailed implementation. It's the same kind of stuff that we're saying in the National Planning Commission.
Okay. Lebora?
I mean, I just want to pick up on something that the Minister has said. There is ample evidence that there's a need for a radical gear or a shifting gear, whatever we want to call it. We can see that the unemployment figures are unabattedly high. We can see that there's a gap in terms of the kind of graduate that we're producing versus what the market calls for. We can see that in relation to other BRIC countries and the kind of economy that South Africa and the nation that South Africa aspires and dreams about being, we are falling far short. Other countries, immediately after their independence, were able to implement free education and to implement mechanisms deliberately in order to develop the kind of economy and the kind of citizenry that they wanted. We quote and look east ad nauseum, but it's a necessary example at this moment. Your Indonesias or your Indias or your Chinas, they did not necessarily happen by happenstance. They decided how many engineers and scientists that they needed, and we haven't done that kind of deliberate planning. And we need to really own up to the fact that the last 18 years have been a series of policy missteps in many respects, whether it's because we don't stick to one thing, one particular instrument for long enough to see it work, whether the gauges and the indicators that we use at the outset are inappropriate for our own market and our own context, or whether it is because we are unable to realize what we need to achieve within particular resource constraints, constitutional restraints, and otherwise. What we need to realize that we are where we are since 1994 as a result of choices that we, as South Africans post-94, have made.
But let me just make this point, because I don't think it's correct, Lebogang, to suggest that we're in the same place we were in 94. There have been very, very significant changes. I think Moletsi has touched on this. You can look at ownership of the economy as one example. There are significant changes, and let's not pretend we're in a pre-94 mode.
It's not a pretense, Minister, but I certainly think that the fact that there are so many protests, the fact that we are seeing that unemployment is
let's analyze them in the instance,
is not really coming down. 40% unofficially, 26% officially. This is a serious structural problem.
Let's bring Uputso Dlamini in here. What needs to be done differently here so that we show the commitment to change?
Before I come to that, let me just address the two matters that have come earlier.
Okay, very
One,
quickly.
that going to this Johannesburg Stock Exchange, at the first top 10, or top 10% from the top, they hold 203 billion rands worth of South Africa's wealth in their hands. And they are males. They are white. Let's be clear on that one. And compare that to the country's GDP. That's in the hands of those few. Two, let us not dilute the essence of what emerges from that conference, that there is a need for the radical, drastic change that must happen in the country. When they say it's not going to be business as usual, let's talk about what is the content of that. You touched the issue of land. Mm-hmm. We heard them saying the willing buyer, willing seller never worked. Let's implement Section 25 of the Constitution thoroughly to the fullest, which says you go to you identify the land, the owner, and you say, I want this land as the state for the economic or for the effective use by the people, and I will pay so much. The owner will not have to argue against that. If she does so in court, it follows that process. We have not been doing that. We must do that going forward. We talk about the issue of youth unemployment. Mm-hmm. There has been suggestions emerging there. We still are yet to see what is the grants for the unemployed youth going to be like.
And just looking at that very point, the youth subsidy versus the youth grant or job seekers grant, what's the difference?
I think the whole concept of the youth subsidy there is being rejected, and we are happy as COSATU that that thing is being rejected by those branches. They now talk the grants for those that can't find jobs to give them some stipends. We don't think it's a solution, but let's hear...
Is it wise? Is it wise to take young people that are in need of jobs and not money and give them stipends? Instead of doing what the youth subsidy was suggesting, which is give the employer an incentive to hire.
That's our point. We're saying give them decent jobs, get them employed. There is infrastructure development that must happen here. Engage our youth. They are capable. Give them the skills, if they lack those skills, to help this country develop its infrastructure. I had that coming. Yes, there is an issue of this youth grants. We must hear more what the conference is saying about that and whether we have enough. What is the difference of that from the youth wage subsidy? Yeah. We have to hear more. But the essence of what is emerging from that Congress has not, it has to be understood as it is, the desire for the radical transformation in this country. And COSATU is on board on that, and will be hell-bent on the ANC and working hard to ensure that that is meaningful to the society.
That's really my issue, that we've got this desire for radical change, but I'm not quite seeing what it's going to translate into, particularly if you look at something like the youth subsidy versus the job seekers grant.
Well, it's not youth subsidy, it's not the land and so on. You know, the government has bought a lot of land. I visited a farm a few months ago in Delmas, where the government paid 8 million rands and bought the land from a gentleman called Mr. Hoffman. The land is derelict now. There are only 2 or 3 people there, and there were more than 50 workers. It was producing maize, it was producing wheat, it was producing beef. There's nothing being produced on that land now. So the government has bought the land, but the issue is if you don't have the farmers with the skills, then you can buy as much land. You can use willing buyer, willing seller if you wish. You can use Section 25 of the Constitution, but that land is going to lie derelict if you don't have. What has been happening to our education to produce agricultural graduates? Those are the issues that you have to address. And what happened in the mid-1990s? The government, and Trevor was part of that government, removed most of the support systems for the commercial farmers. Now we are asking the black farmer to go there without the support systems that the old white farmers used to have. The government has removed them. It says now you go and farm this farm. Of course he can't farm that farm. When the Afrikaner farmer needed the support before from the government in order to do it, we are telling people with even less money, less resources, you do it without the resources that the Afrikaner
Minister,
farmer
your
had.
response quickly before we go to break.
The breaks are a problem.
Yes,
look,
they are.
look, all over the world there has been the freeing up of agriculture. What was removed was the individual marketing board. So there was banana, coffee, chicory, milk, wheat, da-da-da. Ultimately, the costs were being borne by South African consumers, and those who were poor were actually seriously impoverished. The big change when the marketing boards, the individual marketing boards, was removed was a drop in food price inflation. It meant that people could afford food that they hadn't been able to do. It's the way in which we manage the support systems to farmers. You can't just put people on the land. You need a series of support systems. But they can't be too dependent on the state, because agriculture is actually something that involves a lot of hard work as well.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. Remember that you can also still take part by sending us your SMSs 33726, and also our Facebook page, Interface on SABC3. Do stay with us. Welcome back to the last segment of Interface for tonight on SABC3, talking about the ANC's policy conference, particularly looking at the outcomes that came from that conference. We don't have a lot of time and we need to wrap up, but I do want us to touch on the issue of nationalization, what's been called strategic nationalization, and now there's talk that the government might look into getting a 30% stake of new mines, and that's a way of trying to be strategic about this nationalization. What do you make of such an input?
Look, we would have preferred the ANC policy conference to have talked to how we understood and we understand the Freedom Charter to have said. Now there is a new concept, strategic nationalization. Well, we hear them saying there is going to be a mining company. We welcome that. A state bank, we welcome that. But the emphasis has got to be state ownership and how much that means. The question is therefore going to be, is this equal to nationalization? We don't think so. We think there's been a dilution of that concept. But let's get them to implement what they say, because we don't have these things at the moment. And indeed, we're going forward. We will be hell-bent. Rural development, what is the benefit to people? Escalate that. How do we practicalize that? That's what we'll be watching.
Minister, we heard one of your colleagues, Minister Shabangu, saying nationalization will not happen in her lifetime. Is this proposal a move now backwards for the ANC, going back on what it had said?
I don't think that anybody's going back. You know, I go back to 1992. I say there was the words nationalization or joint ventures on the basis of the balance of evidence. And that is very much what we're talking about. You can't be completely silly about this, because we are a savings shy country. We depend on investment from elsewhere. And we need to be smart, because, you know, I think that what you've seen from Aurora and elsewhere is that it's not just owning a mine. It's actually having resources available to invest in the mine. And if you choose to do that, what are you going to give up? Education, health, what are you going to give up? These are choices in governance. The point about mining is the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act placed the mineral resources in the hands of the people as a whole, and that right is now leased. You know, farmers at Agri-SA had gone to court to argue that the holders of surface rights ought to own the mineral rights, and this, I think, has now been dealt with by the Supreme Court of Appeal. I'm sure the ConCourt will confirm the MPRDA. That is the position. It's how you lease the right to mine, the right to prospect, and how you take rents from that, that'll determine the role of the state. And it needs to be very smart, very effective, but we must ensure that we can get the resources to drive change in this country.
Lebogang, just listening to some of the responses from the business fraternity, they're saying, look, we understand the need for change, but you're giving us mixed signals here. We're not quite sure what the ANC is going to do. Are you going to be nationalizing everything? Are you not? Are you taking things away from us? Are you going to create your own? What's going to be happening? What should the ANC be saying to business?
I think that they need to think about which particular sectors and which particular commodities, because I think that certainly wholesale nationalization seems to be off the table for the current moment, for the foreseeable future, and perhaps rightly so. But again, I think language is very important. Words are very important, whether it's a phase, a transition, and whether it's nationalization or state ownership, because there are various models as to how this can be done, whether it is worker-based, whether it is a partial partnership between workers, the state, and private companies. And again, as Duma has said, whether that we can still call that nationalization is a further debate. But there are so many different models as to how this needs to be, as to how this can be done, which have not yet been explored. You can look at how Zambia did it, for example, with the copper mines there, which was...
The proposals on the table, though, are they workable in your view? The 30% ownership in new mines, the having a state mine, a state-owned mine, are those workable?
It depends. I mean, it really, all of these things depend on the intent and the intended outcome, as well as how we implement them. Perhaps we can try, but then the new mines, what about the old mines, I suppose would be another question. What about how we then are able to dispose of and distribute current resources equitably?
All right. Tatumeki, let's give you the last word. We are running out of time. What do you make of where we are now, post this conference, and what are we likely to see in Mangaung?
Well, I go back to what the minister said, which is that we don't generate enough savings, and therefore we don't generate enough investment, and therefore we are not creating jobs. If I understand the minister correctly, that's the summary. Now, the job of the ANC government is, how do you reverse that situation?
Yeah.
It's no use, it's fine for the minister to explain to us this is the problem. But the ANC government or the DA government or the COSATU government, if there will ever be such a thing, their job must be to say to the people of South Africa, this is the problem, Trevor Manuel has identified it, now you elect me to reverse it.
This is the solution, and this is how we're going to do it. And that's how we come to the end of Interface for tonight. Thank you so much to my guests for their contributions, and thank you so much for your participation in this program. Remember, you can email us and keep the conversation going. Interface on SABC3.co.za, and also our Facebook page, Interface at SABC3. From me, Tembisa Machel, and the team, good night.